Social behavior and altruism, a fascinating chapter. It starts out kind of negative, but it gets, well, it continues to be negative, I guess. So, there we go. 1977, Everett Sanderson jumped down onto the subway tracks to save the life of Michelle de Jesus, only seconds before the onrushing train would have struck her. After failing to jump back onto the platform, Sanderson was pulled to safety at the last instant by onlookers. 1999, David Hutmacher was diagnosed with diverticulitis that required him to miss 6 months of work. With Christmas approaching and his sick and personal leave running out, David was surprised to discover his paychecks continuing to be full. David's co-workers had donated their own sick and personal leave to make up his shortfall. In 1999, athlete Yukiko Marth developed an aggressive form of glomerulonephritis, that has to do with her kidneys, that required an immediate kidney transplant. Charlie Keese, a person that she had a passing acquaintance with, donated a kidney and saved Yukiko's life. Al-Qaeda terrorist Usman Khan attacked the patrons of a London museum with knives and a suicide vest in 2019. After killing 2 patrons and wounding 3, Darren Frost and John Crilly chased Khan out of the building and onto the London Bridge, where they parried the knives with a 5-foot narwhal tusk and a fire extinguisher before Khan was shot and killed. And that's Khan, and this is Darren Frost, and that's him with the narwhal tusk, and that's John Crilly with the fire extinguisher, keeping Khan from stabbing anybody else. And that's what a narwhal looks like. It's actually a tooth, and it's a large whale-like creature. In 2007, Cameron Holopeter was waiting for a subway train when he suffered a seizure that threw him onto the tracks. Wesley Autry, seeing the dilemma, jumped onto the tracks and was able to roll the unconscious man into a trench and cover him before a train crushed them both. 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the frozen Potomac River in Washington, D.C. 5 passengers and a flight attendant clung to wreckage in the frozen river as a helicopter plucked them off the debris one by one. Ignoring his own safety, Arland Williams helped the other 5 survivors attach themselves to the rescue rope to be whisked to safety. When they went back for Williams, the cold had claimed him, and he slipped into the water and died. African-American Otis Gaither smashed through the door of a burning mobile home one night and pulled white Larry Whitten to safety. When Whitten failed to respond, Gaither applied CPR, despite the racist symbol that fluttered over his burning structure, the Confederate battle flag. The Avenue of the Righteous among the nations is a line of trees planted commemorating the hundreds of Europeans who saved Jews during Hitler's Holocaust. At great peril to themselves, they provided haven and food for the members of the hunted religion. We all know the parable of maybe we don't know the parable of the Good Samaritan. This was a parable that was told by Jesus. The Samaritans were people of mixed Assyrian and Israeli ancestry who maintained a religion that was similar but not exactly the same as the Israelis. Because they were different, they were despised by the Israelis. One day, an Israeli merchant was robbed, stripped, and left for dead along the road. Because he was naked, no Jewish person would help him. An Israeli priest and a Levite saw him and hustled away, seeing his nakedness and not wanting to soil themselves. A Samaritan came along. Samaritan is, of course, one of these other religious people. A Samaritan came along and bound the merchant's wounds and carried him to an inn to recuperate. He gave the innkeeper a sum of money and promised to make up any difference of if his need exceeded the money that he left. The money that he left. The Samaritan left. The Samaritan left money. So while the Israelis, the Jewish people wouldn't help him, the hated Samaritan did help the wounded Jewish person. Altruism is the act of concern and helping of someone else with no expectation of gaining anything in return. Why people help has been the subject of much research. The social exchange theory purports that people weigh the costs of such interactions and seek to maximize their rewards and minimize their costs. Rewards provided from help may be external or internal. External rewards may be in the form of appreciation or friendship. Therefore, we are more likely to help someone whose approval we desire, someone attractive to us. Internal rewards include increased feelings of self-worth, but it also includes reducing the feelings of distress that one might feel caused by the empathy for someone else's pain. Internal rewards, Clary et al. Researched people who volunteer to help AIDS patients, and I misspelled patients. They found 6 motivations: values, to act on humanitarian values and concern for others; understanding, to learn about people or learn skills; social, to be part of a group and gain approval; career, to enhance job prospects with experience and contacts; ego protection, to reduce guilt or escape personal problems; and esteem enhancement, to boost self-worth and confidence. These are the internal rewards. Social psychologist C. Daniel Batson wrote in 3 different articles, suggested that we may help others because we truly care about them and their suffering. This caring occurs because humans have strong feelings of empathy, compassionate understanding of how the person in need feels. Feelings of empathy encompass sympathy, pity, and sorrow. Some might contend that altruism has so many internal rewards that people do it more for their own benefit than that of others. Thus, they contend that altruism is a form of egoism, or the real benefit is that of the giving individual. However, Daniel Batson sees altruism as working both as a self-serving and selfless act. Batson et al. In 1997 suggested that perspective taking is at the heart of helping acts. According to Batson and colleagues, there are 2 perspectives that are relevant to helping situations: imagine the other and imagine the self. An imagine other perspective operates when you think about how the person in need of help perceives the helping situation and the feelings that are aroused in that situation. An imagined self perspective operates when you imagine how you would think and feel if you were in the victim's situation. Batson referred to our focus on the sufferer's distress as empathy, genuine sympathy and compassion for the other individual. Such empathy comes naturally. Other animals will come to another's aid. They will comfort a sufferer. They will comfort a victim. They will show distress at another's emotional response. A newborn baby will cry when they hear another baby crying. Empathy produces helping even toward members of rival groups. With their empathy aroused, people will help even when they believe no one will know about their helping. With their empathy aroused, people will violate their own standards of fairness and justice by giving the person favored treatment. Sometimes people will help others when there is no self-interest involved, but because society prescribes the helping behavior as a norm. There are 2 social norms. Reciprocity norms are expectations that if you help a person, they will help and not hurt you. Social responsibility norms are expectations that people will help those dependent upon them. Evolutionary psychology purports that animals are driven to maximize the survival of their own genes. Thus, an individual is more likely to put their children's welfare ahead of their own, though children are less likely to sacrifice themselves for their parents. This kin favoritism is referred to as kin selection, favoritism for those who share our genes. This favoritism may be prevalent with people who aren't actually relatives, but who look similar to us, like all yellow labs. Evolutionary psychologists also believe that we may help others because we expect others to return the favor, and this is known as reciprocity. While reciprocity is unlikely to work in large impersonal urban areas, it does tend to work in small, isolated groups. People in a small group feel closer to the others in the group and will often sacrifice for them with the understanding that when fortunes are reversed, reciprocity will happen. Large and impersonal sometimes has the opposite effect. In 1964, Kitty Genovese was attacked by a knife-wielding rapist in front of her own apartment house in Queens. For 35 minutes, she fought off her rapist while screaming in terror in the middle of the street. 35 of her neighbors were aroused and observed the attack from the safety of their homes. None helped. None even called the police. Kitty Genovese was raped and died from her wounds. Andrew Moormill was attacked on a crowded subway car. He was knifed in the stomach. His attackers left the car at the next stop. 11 riders watched the man bleed to death as they rode home. An 18-year-old switchboard operator was sexually assaulted while working alone. She escaped out in the street, naked and bleeding, with her attacker in pursuit. 40 pedestrians watched as the attacker tried to pull her back inside. 2 policemen happened by and stopped the assault. Eleanor Bradley tripped and broke her leg in a crowded street. Dazed and in pain, she pleaded for help. For 40 minutes, shoppers merely parted and flowed around her. A cab driver finally helped her to a doctor. In June of 2000, a parade that wound past Central Park took a turn for the macabre when groups of drunk men began dousing women with water and tearing the clothes off of and fondling the female parade watchers. Ann Payton was forced to negotiate her way home, her underwear torn away. Police ignored the problem, and no calls from cell phones were received despite the thousands who watched the attacks. The Kitty Genovese rape and murder was a wake-up call for social psychologists. Unwilling to accept the callousness of Kitty's neighbors, psychologists began researching to discover how and why such egregious crimes can be watched and allowed to continue with no one lifting a finger to help. Noticing, researchers discovered that people in large groups are less observant than people in small groups. Research done with smoke pouring from an air vent demonstrated that people in large groups took 4 times as long to see the smoke. Thus, the people in the crowd partying around Eleanor Bradley may not have even noticed Eleanor laying there until after they passed. With advance notice and a less crowded sidewalk, the individual may have been more likely to see Eleanor and evaluate her need. And this is, of course, known as the bystander effect. Interpreting, the larger the group of people, the more likely that an individual will accept the implied definition of an event of the group. If everyone else in a group seems unconcerned, an individual is less likely to interpret a situation as negative. This is partially due to pluralistic ignorance, the mistaken interpretation that others are feeling what we are due to our illusion of transparency, the overestimation of others' ability to read our internal states. Latine and Rodin staged an experiment around a woman in distress. 70% of the individuals, when alone, responded to the woman's obvious distress. 40% of the pairs responded to the woman's distress. Of the 60% who didn't respond, most interpreted the situation as a non-emergency. As the number of people witnessing the emergency increased, the less likely anyone would render assistance. And this, of course, is part of the bystander effect. Assuming responsibility, not only are people more likely to misinterpret an actor's actions while in a group, but they're also more likely to misinterpret the willingness of other bystanders to help. It seems that the more people who witness a situation, the more likely each is to assume that someone else will take responsibility for the situation, a diffused responsibility for the action. Diffusion of responsibility, studies in large cities and more rural settings show that the fewer the people involved, the more likely people will intervene. Youssef and Corte, looking at New Yorkers' failure time and time again to respond to the aid of the individuals, refers to the atmosphere in large municipalities as sensory overload and compassion fatigue. And I gave you two examples. The subway was in New York, and also the Kitty Genovese case was in New York. To exonerate humanity, when people are with people they know, they are more likely to try to help. Latane and Darley in 1968 suggested that a bystander must notice the situation, label the situation correctly as an emergency, and assume responsibility for helping. Barley and Latane proposed that there is a factor even beyond assuming responsibility. The individual must decide how to help. Help, according to these researchers, could take the form of direct intervention or indirect intervention. An indirect intervention would be calling somebody else to help. Direct intervention would be helping yourself, doing the helping yourself. And this is what this is the Darley and Latane intervention model. The emergency occurs. The first step is noticing that something is happening. The second step is interpreting the event as an emergency. The third step is taking responsibility for providing help. The fourth step, decide how to help. And the fifth step is providing help. And of course, at any of these stages, you can walk away, except, of course, for step 5. Stage 1, noticing the situation. Before a person can intervene in a situation, that person must notice that an emergency exists. Before one can act, one must be aware that something has occurred. Noticing involves a stimulus that stands out against a background. This is also true when noticing an emergency. Our chances of noticing an emergency increase if it stands out against the background of everyday life. Anything that makes the emergency more conspicuous will increase the probability that we will attend to it. Stage 2, labeling the situation as an emergency. The next step is to correctly label it as one that requires intervention. A very important factor at this stage is whether there is ambiguity or uncertainty about what has happened. Recognizing an emergency can be highly ambiguous because there is often more than one interpretation for a situation. Correctly labeling a situation as an emergency may depend on whether you can tell the difference between an emergency and a more benign situation. And this picture is kind of interesting. This lady's holding her chest and her stomach at the same time. Is she meditating? Is she praying? Or is she having a heart attack or a stomach ache? The presence of other bystanders may affect the labeling process. Reactions of other bystanders often determine the response to the situation. If bystanders show little concern over the emergency, individuals will be less likely to help. When we are placed in a social situation, especially an ambiguous one, we look around us to see what others are doing, the process of social comparison. If others are not concerned, we may not define the situation as an emergency, and we probably will not offer to help. One of the things that we have noticed in modern times is that when there is an emergency, there are a lot of people that are standing around videotaping it. They're videoing with their cell phones. It's so strange. So rather than helping or doing something that would alleviate the situation, they're just filming it. Noticing and correctly labeling a situation as an emergency is not enough to guarantee that a bystander will intervene. As the number of bystanders increases, the likelihood of the participant helping the victim decreases. The more participants involved, the slower the response. There is evidence for a positive bystander effect when the intervention required is dangerous. In a dangerous situation, the presence of others increases helping compared to if a helper is alone. If the consequences to the helper is physical, bystander effect is also reduced. The bystander effect is less likely to occur when the helping situation confronted involves a clear violation of a social norm that we personally care about. People who feel competent, though stage 4 is deciding how to help, people who feel competent who have the necessary skills are more likely to help than those who feel that they lack competence. There are two reasons why greater competence may lead to more helping. Feelings of competence increases confidence in one's ability to help and to know what ought to be done. Feelings of competence increases sensitivity to the needs of others and empathy toward victims. People who feel like leaders are probably also more likely to help because they feel more confident about being able to help successfully. Stage 5, implementing the decision to help, a person may still choose not to intervene. People's evaluation of the rewards and costs involved in helping affect their decision to help or not to help. There are potential rewards for helping: gratitude from the victim, monetary reward, recognition by peers, and for not helping, avoiding potential danger, arriving for an appointment on time. Similarly, there are costs of helping: possible injury, embarrassment, inconvenience, and for not helping, loss of self-esteem. Generally, research indicates that the greater the cost of helping, the less likely people are to help. Conversely, the greater the potential reward for helping, the more likely it is that a person will help. Fritsch et al. In 2000 found 6 variables in determining willingness to give help. First of all is the victim responsibility. Secondly, urgency of the help. Third, time required for help. Fourth, diffusion of responsibility. Fifth, discomfort involved in helping. And sixth is the victim's deservingness. And of course, this is a child and this is a man that's saving her from floodwaters. And so he would assume that she has deservingness. If we see someone else helping, it can affect whether we implement a decision to help. Seeing another person helping increases the likelihood that we ourselves will also help. Seeing another person acting in an altruistic manner elicits a unique emotion in us called elevation. And these, of course, are meerkats. Likelihood of helping can be affected by the bystander's mood. People are more likely to help on a sunny day than on a cloudy day, presumably because the sun puts them in a better mood. Although positive mood is related to an increase in helping, it does not lead to more helping if the person thinks that helping will destroy the good mood. Good moods seem to generate good thoughts about people, and this increases helping. People in good moods also are less concerned with themselves and more likely to be sensitive to other people, making them more aware of other people's needs. A factor that can affect helping is whether an individual received help when they needed help. Gratitude is an emotional state that has 3 functions relating to prosocial behavior. Gratitude acts as a sort of moral barometer, indicating a change in one's state of mind after receiving help. Gratitude can function as a moral motivator, impelling the recipient of help to reciprocate their benefactor or stranger to their benefactor or strangers. Gratitude can serve as a moral reinforcer. When someone expresses gratitude after receiving help, it increases the likelihood that the recipient of the gratitude will engage in prosocial behavior in the future. And this is really kind of an interesting picture because that pen certainly didn't write those letters because that pinpoint is not quite that large. Gratitude increases a sense of self-worth, which then relates to an increase in the likelihood of helping others. Gratitude appears to be an important factor in increasing helping behavior. A decision to help or not to help also affected by the victims is affected by the victim's characteristics. Males are more likely to help females than to help other males. Females are equally likely to help male and female victims. Physically attractive people are more likely to receive help than unattractive people, so you better be pretty or nobody's going to help you. Potential helpers also make judgments about whether a victim deserves help. If we perceive that a person got into a situation through his own or her own negligence and is therefore responsible for their own fate, we tend to generate just world thinking. According to the just world hypothesis, we believe that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. This type of thinking often leads us to devalue a person whom we think caused his or her misfortune. Generally, we give less help to victims we perceive to have contributed to their own fate than to those we perceive as needy through no fault of their own. Schmidt and Weiner in 1988 reported that emotions aroused are important factors in one's reaction to a person in need. If a victim's situation arouses anger, as in the controllable situation, we are less likely to give help than if the victim's situation arouses sympathy, as in the uncontrollable situation. Apparently, we are quite harsh when it comes to a victim whom we perceive as having contributed to their own plight. We reserve our sympathy for those victims who had little or no control over their own fates. And of course, if you look at this picture, this man is laying on the grass, but he's also got a bottle of Smirnoff's in his armpit right there. A meta-analysis of the literature in this area found that race and helping present a rather complex picture. Black and white victims, given the same helping situation, are equally likely to receive help. Saussure et al. Found that blacks are less likely to receive help than whites under the following conditions: when the help required longer commitments of time, when the help was more risky, when the help was more difficult, when the distance between the helper and the victim increased, when a white helper could rationalize away non-helping. The relationship between race and helping behavior is complex and involves numerous situational factors as well as racial attitudes. And I would imagine it's probably a little bit different around the country because there are different racial attitudes around in different parts of the United States. Bias exists against black victims, but the bias is not extreme. Clear discrimination against black victims was reported in 44% of the studies reviewed. 56% showed no discrimination, or blacks were helped more quickly than whites. Whites and blacks discriminate against the opposite race at about the same level. Whites discriminate against black victims more under remote conditions over the telephone than in face-to-face situations. Increasing the chances of receiving help, make your plea for help as loud as possible. Yelling and waving your arms increases the likelihood that others will notice your plight. Make your plea as clear as possible. You do not want to leave any room for doubt that you need help. This will help bystanders correctly label the situation as an emergency. Now we're looking at two different, a man waving his arms in two different manners. This may be saying hi, and of course he may be ignored, and this is him saying I'm in trouble with waving both hands. Increase the chances that a bystander will assume responsibility for helping you. Don't count on this happening by itself. Anything you can do to increase the bystander's personal responsibility for helping will increase your chances of getting help. Making eye contact is one way to do this. Making a direct request is another. According to Shepala et al., courageous resistance is selfless behavior in which there is a high risk or cost to the actor and possibly to the actor's family or associates, where the behavior must be sustained over time, is most often deliberative, and often where the actor is responding to a moral calling. This is a famous scene from the Tiananmen Square. This is an individual that they refer to as Tank Man. And what he did, he jumped in front of a tank and he wouldn't let him get around him. Now, this was the lead tank, and actually the tanks backed up behind him, and there were about 10 of them. And he's famous to the extent that there have been statues to this man around the world because he was so courageous to face off against a tank. Tank Man. And this is what actually happened. Now, eventually he got out of the way, and strangely enough, the tanks didn't move after he left. A concept closely related to courageous resistance is heroism. Heroism is any helping act that involves significant risk above what is normally expected and serves some socially valued goal. If a firefighter goes back several times into a building on the verge of collapse to rescue victims, that would qualify as heroic. A second requirement of a heroic act is that it serves some valued goal. Saving lives is certainly a valued goal, as is putting one's job on the line to expose a wrong. And of course, this is a picture from World War II. You can see all the servicemen as heroes. That was the Army Air Corps. This is the Army, the Navy, and the Marines, and that's the Red Cross. There is evidence for any altruistic personality or a cluster of personality traits, including empathy, that predisposes individuals to great acts of altruism. Situational factors and personality factors combine to influence altruism. Autonomous altruism is selfless hope that society does not reinforce, since some altruism may be discouraged by society. A normocentric motivation for helping is oriented more toward a group, perhaps society, with whom an individual identifies than toward the individual in need. This type of altruism is known as normative altruism, altruism that society supports and encourages. Rescuers are not wealthier than non-rescuers. Family support is important for the rescue effort. Rescuers tended to help in response to a specific request for help. Most of the people rescuers help are strangers. Rescuers and non-rescuers differ from each other less by circumstance than by their upbringing and personalities. Rescuers exhibit a strong feeling of personal responsibility for the welfare of other people and a compelling need to act on that felt responsibility. They are moved by the pain of the innocent victims, by their sadness, helplessness, and desperation. Empathy for the victim is an important factor driving this form of altruism. Rescuers and non-rescuers did not differ significantly on general measures of empathy. They do differ on a particular type of empathy called emotional empathy, which centers on one's sensitivity to the pain and suffering of others. This empathy, coupled with a sense of social responsibility, increases the likelihood that an individual will make and keep a commitment to help. Characteristics of rescuers, the inability to blend in with others in the environment. They tend to stand out. Rescuers exhibit a high level of independence and self-reliance. Rescuers have an enduring commitment to helping those in need before the emergency. The emergency does not make these people altruists. It allows these individuals to remain altruists in a new situation. Rescuers have a matter-of-fact attitude about their rescue efforts. Rescuers are able to put aside the characteristics of those they help. Oliner and Oliner in 1988 found that the child-rearing styles used by parents of rescuers contributed to the development of prosocial attitudes and behaviors. The techniques used by parents of rescuers fostered empathy in the rescuers. A child who has parents who provide a supportive environment, use authoritative parenting, and use a less restrictive parenting style shows higher levels of prosocial, more reasoning than parents who do not show these parenting characteristics. It is not enough for parents simply to embrace altruistic values and provide positive role models. They must also exert firm control over their children. Parents who raise altruistic children coach them to be helpful and firmly teach them how to be helpful. Parents who are warm and nurturing and use reasoning with a child as a discipline technique are more likely to produce an altruistic child than cold, uncaring, punitive parents. A child's prosocial behavior undergoes changes, moving from more simple forms of helping to more sophisticated ones. Instrumental helping involves helping another person accomplish something, for example, get something off of a shelf. Children are capable of this form of helping at a young age, 12 to 14 months. Empathic helping is emotion-based helping focused on the well-being of another person. This form of helping develops later. Eisenberg found that as children get older, they are more likely to understand the needs of other people and are less focused on their own selfish concerns. And of course, if you remember, Piaget called it egocentrism, this selfish concerns. The research suggests that this is a continual process and that people's altruistic thinking and behavior can change throughout life. The idea that the development of altruism is a lifelong process is supported by the fact that rescuers do not magically become caring and empathic with an emergency. The ethic of caring grew out of their personalities and interpersonal styles, which had developed over the course of their lives. Altruism requires something more than empathy and compassionate values. It requires a psychological and practical competence to carry those intentions into action. Goodness, like evil, begins slowly in small steps. Many rescuers gradually ease themselves into their roles as rescuers. People responded to a first request for help. Once they took that first step, they began to see themselves as the kind of person who rescued the desperate. Altruistic actions change their self-concept. The interactionist view of altruism argues that an individual's internal motives, whether altruistic or selfish, interact with the situational factors to determine if a person will help. Romer and his colleagues identified four altruistic orientations based on the individual's degree of nurturance, the need to give help, and of succurrence, the need to receive help. The first is altruistic, those who are motivated to help others but not receive help in return. The second is receptive giving, those who help to obtain something in return. The third is selfish, those who are primarily motivated to receive help but not to give it. And inner sustaining, those who are not motivated to give or receive help. Now, I would say that this individual who's bragging about the fact she's a volunteer is probably thinking that she's going to obtain something in return. Seeking help has both positive and negative aspects. On the positive side, the help a person needs will often be forthcoming. On the negative side, a person may feel threatened or suffer loss of self-esteem by asking for help. In Western society, a great premium is placed on being self-sufficient and taking care of oneself. There is a social stigma attached to seeking help, along with potential feelings of failure. Culture and ethnicity can also affect one's predisposition towards seeking help. Individuals may be more likely to ask for help when their need is low than when it is high. This could be related to the perceived power relationship between the helper and the recipient. When need is low, people may perceive themselves to be on more common footing with the helper. When need is low, there is less cost to the helper. People may be less likely to seek help if the cost to the helper is high. Participants are more likely to seek help from a friend than from a stranger. When help is sought from a friend, the potential cost to the helper is not important. When the helper is a stranger, participants are reluctant to ask when the cost was high. People may feel more comfortable and less threatened asking a friend rather than a stranger for costly help. The norm of reciprocity may come into play in a more meaningful way with friends. People may reason that they would do it for their friends if they needed it. Thus, the expectation of reciprocity may make it easier to ask for high-cost help from friends. People may perceive that they will have more opportunities to reciprocate a friend's help. They may never see a stranger again. Receiving help is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, people are grateful for receiving help. On the other hand, they may experience negative feelings when they are helped, feelings of guilt, lowered self-esteem, and indebtedness. There are four potentially negative outcomes of receiving help. An inequitable relationship may be created. Those who are helped may experience psychological reactance, that is, they may feel their freedom is threatened by receiving help. Those who receive help may make negative attributions about the intent of those who have helped them. Those who receive help may suffer a loss of self-esteem. When inequity occurs, we feel distress and are motivated to restore equity. Helping someone creates inequity in a relationship because the recipient feels indebted to the helper. The greater the inequity and the greater the negative feelings. A recipient reacts more negatively to help and likes the helper less if he or she does not have the ability to reciprocate. Perhaps the strongest explanation for the negative impact of receiving help centers on the threats to self-esteem. When people become dependent on others, especially in Western society, their self-esteem and self-worth come into question. Under these conditions, receiving help may be a threatening experience. Participants who have positive thoughts about themselves are more negatively affected by help than those who have negative thoughts about themselves. The offer of help is a greater threat to those with high self-esteem than to those with low self-esteem. In other words, not only does receiving help threaten self-esteem, but also the higher a person's self-esteem is, the more threatened the person is by offers of help. Receiving help can be particularly threatening when it is unsolicited and imposed by someone else. Receiving unwanted help is not only psychologically threatening, but is physiologically arousing. Receiving help from an out-group member appears to be a threat to one's self-esteem. Females perceive help as more threatening to self-esteem than do males. Females are more satisfied than males with the help that they receive, and females are more likely than males to express a need for help. Reactions to receiving help are influenced by several factors, including the ability to reciprocate, the similarity or dissimilarity of the helper, self-esteem, and gender. A positive outcome is more likely if the help is offered rather than requested, if the help is given on an ego-relevant task, and if the help does not compromise the recipient's freedom, for example, with a very high obligation to repay the helper. We see that an individual's reaction to receiving help is influenced by an interaction between situational variables and personality variables. And that is the end of me saying help and rescue. Oh, good. So next week is the last week, or is the last lecture. It's chapter 12. So I'll see you next week.